Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Matthew W.I. Dunn, and this is for the course Encountering Sacred Writings. And as you all know, on one of the classes last week, of course, one time it had to happen when I set the recorder to record my screen, it did not record. When I got to the very end of the recording and went to save it, all I saw was the control panel was a big black box, and apparently I crashed for some reason, so nothing was recorded. So I promised you that I would re-record the class, and I would put it on YouTube. For anyone who needs it, you shouldn't need it because you should have your notes from the class. I think everyone was there that day. I can check my attendance, but I believe everyone was there, most everyone. So you should have notes, you have the PowerPoint, and you should have been listening, hopefully, during the class. But I still want to go through the notes or do the lecture online so that you have it. Thinking if I should play a little music for us. I forget what I played for us on. Well, it is Advent time, and so I'll play something for you right here. And you can skip over this if you want, or you can just sit back and listen. It's a little Christmassy, from a band called Emerald. Actually, well, that didn't work very well. Hold on a second. A band called Emerald. Go into my music. Little known Christian band. I stumbled upon them years ago and really liked them. Here we go.
Beyond the grave, in the realm of the Lord.
Starts again. Okay. Yeah, one of my favorite bands. They only put out one CD, one album, unfortunately, but they are one of my favorite bands. Um, okay. Born to Die so we might live. Yes, it's Christmas time, people, or at least the preparation for Christmas time. And so I thought that was an appropriate song. Um, okay, so the subject here is an overview of biblical history, and I'm kind of glomming that together with the Gospels because I'm talking about Jesus anyways, and Jesus is part of biblical history and an overview of the Bible. So I just kind of reversed the Gospels with the Pentateuch, as I told you. So I've been talking about Jesus, and I stopped talking about in the last class about why Jesus died, the death of Jesus. Ignore that. Someone just sending me an email. And I talked about blasphemy. Okay, Jesus had opponents, and the religious opponents were against him because they thought he was blaspheming. He was doing things and saying things that they thought were disrespectful to God. And according to the Jewish law was very clear that if a Jewish person blasphemed the Lord, that he or she should die. They should be stoned to death. If I remember correctly, the passage, I want to say, might be in the book of Numbers. But anyways, it says, you take the man outside the village and stone him to death, okay, until he's dead. Well, the Jews couldn't really, I didn't mention this in class, but I'll mention it here. The Jews couldn't really do that to Jesus, although, and according to the Gospel of John, at least once or twice they tried to do that. But actually, remember, the Romans were in charge, not the Sanhedrin. There was no king or no ruler over the Jews. So the Jews couldn't put anyone to death legally. So they had to avert to the Romans. They had to find some way to have the Romans kill Jesus. So that was a major concern for the Jews, the Jewish people who were the opponents of Jesus. It was not a political thing because claiming to be the Christ was not a claim to divinity. It was not, the Christ was sent in the name of God. So it wasn't blasphemous for someone to say he was the Christ or claim that. People might have thought he was delusional, Jesus was delusional, or somebody else was delusional, or just simply wrong, or lying, or whatever. Or someone might have actually believed that it was true. But it certainly wasn't a blasphemy. It wasn't disrespect to God. And yet that's the thread that runs throughout all the gospel stories in regarding in regards to Jesus's conflict with the Jews, the people, his own people, is that he's a blasphemer. Okay, for the Romans, if we ask the question, why did Jesus die? The question is rather simply answered. Jesus was claiming to be a ruler. At least they thought so. Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, who was a king savior, a warrior king, who was the ruler of the Jews. Well, no, the Romans in their minds were the rulers of the Jews. And so to claim that you were a ruler in competition with or in opposition to the Roman emperor, represented by the local prefect, who in this case, in the time of Jesus, was Pontius Pilate, one of several Roman prefects or governors of Judea. That was a treasonous statement or claim, and that would have also warrant the death penalty from the eyes of the Roman authorities. Okay, so now we come to Pontius Pilate. Why did Jesus die for the Romans? It's because Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, apparently. And so enter into the story this man, Pontius Pilate, whose name we only know really because of his connection to Jesus of Nazareth. If Pontius Pilate were not part of the story of this man Jesus, we probably we might not know him at all. We might know one or two things about him, and that's about it. But his name becomes so much more famous because of his connection to the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. That doesn't mean we still know a lot about him, actually. We don't. Okay? We know he existed. Now we know he existed. That he was the governor of the region of Judea. Okay? which we saw a map before. If I go back to the map, let me put myself up here. Go back to this map here. Here we go. Come on. There we go. This area, generally called Judea, but it's made up of other sections. But this whole area was governed directly by the Romans through their prefects, one of them being Pontius Pilate. There were several other prefects, both before and after Pilate. And then the Galilee, where Jesus grew up, and Perea, were actually both governed by Herod Antipas, one of the children of King Herod the Great. This region in orange, Trachonitis, it's called in the Gospel, but again, it includes other areas, was ruled by Herod Philip, also one of the progeny of Herod the Great. The Decapolis was independent, was its own. Syria was another province. Actually, Syria was the main province that controlled Judea. So Pontius Pilate would have been under whoever was the head of the province of Syria, and I'm sure historians know, but I don't know. I'd have to look it up. Nevertheless, so Pontius Pilate was the prefect at the time of Jesus' death, but not the whole life of Jesus, as you can see from his dates. Pontius Pilate ruled as prefect from 26 AD until 36 AD. So it's right there around the time when people believe that Jesus was killed or Jesus died under Pontius Pilate. So those are his dates. So that fits. Until in 1961, in northern Israel, the northern country of Israel, archaeologists found this stone, which apparently was part of a building that also apparently was built by Pontius Pilate, or at least at his direction, because it has his name. This is our first actual hard historical evidence, I should say, because there were stories about him before that, and that's historical. But our first hard evidence outside of literary mentionings for the man Pontius Pilate. So that's kind of good. But notice it took almost 2,000 years to get it. Until then, our references to Pontius Pilate were mostly in the Gospels, the four Gospels, and some scattered references to him in other writings. So we don't know much about him. We know when he was prefect of Judea. We know from this Pontius Pilate inscription that he did exist. Okay. And according to the inscription, if you translate the inscription, it mentions the Emperor Tiberius. Apparently, Pontius Pilate built some kind of building, temple, just a building, regular building, who knows, in honor of the current emperor, or the reigning emperor, who was Tiberius. And here's his name, Pontius, the end of his name, Pontius, and then Pilatus, so Pontius Pilate. You see the end of the word prefect, Praefectus Judeae, so prefect of Judea, and the bottom word is very hard to make out. We can make out maybe one letter, and scholars theorize that it probably is the word dedicated in Latin. So roughly translated from what we have, this fragmentary statement on this piece of stone is, this Tiberium, this building of Tiberius, or for Tiberius, was dedicated by Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. Okay? So we built some building to honor the emperor, which, was a nice thing. You wanted to kind of curry favor with the higher-ups, and so you built buildings for them in their honor. We have no clue where Pontius Pilate was born. We have no clue where or when he died. No clue where he was from, okay, which kind of goes with not knowing where he was born, so we don't know where he grew up. As I said, there are some scattered references to him outside of the four Gospels in Jewish authors, and I wrote these names on the board. I'm not going to write them again, but Josephus Flavius and another Jewish author named Philo, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt, and they were Jewish writers, and both of them agree that Pontius Pilate was not a nice man. He did not have a good reputation amongst the Jewish populace because he would antagonize the Jewish populace. He would do things that would especially insult their religious sensibilities, things having to do with the temple and religious practices that would make the Jews riot basically and freak out. So he was not well liked. And so in the gospel stories, his only question to Jesus is, are you claiming to be a king? Are you saying you're a ruler? Pontius Pilate has no concern about religious claims that Jesus might be making or things that he might be doing that are breaking Jewish religious law. Pontius Pilate could care less about that. His question in all of the four Gospels and all of the tradition that we have of the trial of Jesus is simply, what are you saying you are? You're saying you're a ruler? Okay, if you really believe that, then you're dead. Then you are, you will be executed. And that's what happens to Jesus. Pontius Pilate thinks that Jesus was somehow, by his actions and by his words, actually claiming to be this Messiah figure, the Christ. And so he was worthy. That was treason. And so he was guilty of that crime and would be sentenced to death by crucifixion. Okay, and I skipped over these things. Are you the king of the Jews? That's Pilate's question. That's all he seems to care about. And as I pointed out to you, this picture, which maybe I'll make a little bit bigger here, a little bit larger so you can see it. Okay, is of a building in Jerusalem that was being excavated for archaeological purposes. It had been, I think, a prison at one time when the Ottoman Turks from Turkey ruled Palestine, and they had built a building over a previous building whose foundation you can see here on the left and some of it to the right. Okay, so there was a previous building here that a much later structure was built over, and digging down, archaeologists got to the original, what seems to be the original structure, or at least the structure that was existing in the time of Jesus. And there's good reason to believe, by the archaeologists have good reason to believe, that actually these foundations, these walls, were actually part of the praetorium of Pontius Pilate. And as I explained to you, a praetorium, that's hard kind of to pin down what a praetorium was. But from what it seems to have been the name for a tent that a Roman general would live in, would reside in during battle. Okay, so the king would be, or the general would be in the tent, sleeping, eating, meeting with his other generals or whatever, other officials, and making plans, while all the soldiers were out there just living outside in nature, okay, and fighting and stuff like that. It's like a command center, I guess you could say. And then later on, it came to be the term used for buildings, certain buildings that were in places, a city or someplace, where like the Roman ruler, the governor would stay. And remember, Pontius Pilate was a prefect, which, as I believe I also told you, means that Pilate had control over taxation, so the money flowing in and out, mainly the money flowing out, I guess. Yeah, I should say the money flowing out, that's taxation, maybe not so much in. And then number two, he had control over the military. Okay, so that made him a prefect. So yeah, there's that military connection. Okay, so a praetorium. So there's that connection with the military and the tent that a general would live in. So he would, when he was in Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate did not live in Jerusalem. He actually lived on the coast. The governors of Judea lived on the coast on the Mediterranean Sea. But for major festivals like the Passover, they would come in and travel into Jerusalem to basically keep an eye on stuff, because they knew that tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Jews would be packing themselves into the city. They were worried about riots and insurrections and all that sort of stuff. So, usually the prefect or the procurator or whoever was the governor or ruler would, just come in and stay in the praetorium in Jerusalem to just see that things were okay and went smoothly. And this seems to be that praetorium. So we have, again, hard archaeological evidence or whatever for the site of Jesus's trial. This is apparently where Pilate, it was within the walls of the praetorium, that Pilate interrogated Jesus and sentenced him to death. Okay, maybe not in this actual room, but within the confines of this wall. And this praetorium, this building, was only found in 2001. Okay, so it wasn't found a long time ago. Interesting. Okay, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Let's go to our next slide. So Jesus was condemned to death. Something about Jesus convinced Pontius Pilate that yes, he was claiming to be some kind of ruler. He wasn't just some local rabble rouser, because Jesus didn't stir any. I mean, there had been people before Jesus, at the time of Jesus, who had also kind of stirred things up and tried to get people to revolt. And the Romans killed them. They responded appropriately to what they thought. But Jesus, we have no evidence that Jesus was doing that at all. Jesus wasn't raising an army. He wasn't telling people to oppose Roman government. Jesus said almost nothing about the Romans. In fact, one of the few stories we have about Jesus and his relationship to Rome is where it's the question of paying taxes to the Romans. And Jesus basically doesn't answer the question. He says, taxes is just money. You give it to the government. Give to God what is God's. Jesus spiritualizes it and supernaturalizes the question. Don't worry about who you're giving your taxes to. Worry about what you're doing for God. So he kind of sidesteps deftly that question, okay? Because they're trying to trap him and trick him and to get him into saying, don't pay your taxes to Caesar, which could have also been a reason for Jesus to have been killed. But Jesus wasn't doing that. But, he gets crucified. He's judged guilty and he's sentenced to death by crucifixion. And that is historically appropriate. Again, crucifixion would have been reserved for outlaws, the lowest of the low, true criminals, and of course non-Roman citizens, which Jesus wasn't. Okay, Roman citizens could not be crucified. Never. They should never be crucified. The way a Roman was executed was by having his or her head chopped off. And now that was seen as merciful because it was seen as pretty much quick. Okay, whereas crucifixion could take days or weeks for a person to die on the cross. And it was apparently quite painful. I've never been crucified, but, anyone who's written about it in the ancient world said it was an horrific way to die, long, painful, not something you wanted to have happen to you. So Roman citizens could not be. I'm not saying that they never were. Okay, there are some stories of Romans being crucified. However, the reason that we know those stories about certain Romans having been crucified was because it was such an outrage. It was such a scandal that it was so illegal that someone with Roman citizenship should be nailed to a cross that it was brought up, against the people who did it, like, look what they did. They're bad people, Anyway, so Jesus was not a Roman citizen, he was deemed a criminal, so that's where he was going to end up. He was going to end up on the cross. And what is crucifixion? Crucifixion is very simple. You put a pole or a stake into the ground, and then you basically suspend someone from it, either by tying them to it or nailing them to it in some way. Okay? The most common form seems to have been the cross that we see all the time with the person out with their arms outstretched. Okay, there's the pole standing up in the ground, which was always there. The Romans were very efficient. It made no sense to keep making new poles to put in the ground. You just left the poles there because you're going to keep reusing them, for criminals. What you did do is have the criminal carry the beam of the cross on his back. So he would carry the cross beam on his back to the cross, the pole, the stake, and you would then nail him to it or tie him to it and then hoist him up on the cross and attach him perpendicularly to the cross. So he's either tied there on the beam or he's tied and nailed or whatever to the cross. And he dies from that. Hopefully, that's what they're hoping. That's his punishment. And so that's what crucifixion is. You're making a cross, crux facio, cross. This is a cross, this is a cross. Facio means to make, so you make a cross from these two things. All right. And so crucifixion is a form of capital punishment in which a person is fixed to a beam in a cross-like manner, suspended from a stake that has been placed in the ground. Okay. As I said, it was an horrific practice. It was also a shameful death and a humiliating death. The person was stripped naked, okay, when he was nailed to, usually a man, was nailed to the cross. So you could see all his bits. It was all there. So everything was uncovered. So that was shameful. And it was, excuse me. What else did I want to say? Yeah, and it was not an easy way to die. People think that the people usually associate the crucifixion with loss of blood, especially with Jesus, and so sometimes you'll see images of the crucifixion, and the corpus, the body of Jesus on the cross, will be all bloody and beaten and bruised, and with all sorts of wounds. A lot of times I think you see this kind of representation down in South America. If you've ever traveled down there, I have not, but I've seen pictures of crucifixion scenes from South American churches, and that kind of feeds people's their faith, because it shows a theological meaning. It shows forth a theological understanding of the death of Jesus, of how Jesus suffered. Okay. Well, yes, Jesus did suffer, but that blood loss was not the point of crucifixion. It was not the reason that you died. The reason that you died was from suffocation or asphyxiation. Because as a person is suspended on the cross, it's all dead weight. The whole weight of your body is being suspended into thin air, basically. You're just tied or nailed to the wood. So you have to keep pushed in order to breathe and to fill your diaphragm. You have to keep pushing with your feet, keep pushing the body up so that you can fill your diaphragm and breathe. Well, eventually the muscles of the body, the leg muscles, the abdominal muscles, simply become exhausted. Anyone who's lifted weights in a gym, when you're lifting especially heavy weights, maybe you can, pump 25 pounds 10 times, and then you get to 15, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I can't even lift it half away anymore, and then you can't lift it up at all. And it's like, well, what's this all about? It's the same muscle, the muscle's not torn. No, but the muscle's been exhausted. Its energy resources have been exhausted, and it just doesn't have the energy. That's why you put the weight down, you go do something else, and you come back 10 minutes or 15 minutes later, you pick it up, you can actually start pumping the iron again. All right. Well, how did that work? I couldn't do it before, I was exhausted. Well, energy. Well, that's what happens with crucifixion. Your legs become so tired that they can no longer sustain or uphold the weight of the body, and so the person just slumps down. The diaphragm is not moving anymore. The lungs are not filling with air, and the person suffocates to death. Runs out of oxygen, no oxygen in the lungs. So it's not about blood loss. It can be about blood if a person were deemed an especially dangerous or bad criminal, and the Romans really wanted to punish that person, then yes, they might up the ante by whipping them before the crucifixion, or nailing their hands and their feet. Okay, that tells you something about the seriousness of the charge against the person. But someone just, picked up for being a thief or stealing stuff and is going to be crucified, they might just hang them, just hang them on the beam there, okay? But someone like Jesus, now notice how Jesus was crucified. I mean, they not only put a crown of thorns on his head, okay, that they placed on his head, all right? They whipped him before he was crucified, and he was apparently nailed both in his hands, not only in his hands, but also in his feet. In his feet. So that tells you how serious the crime was against Jesus. What the Romans thought about it. So that's how it happened. That's how death happened with crucifixion. And as I said, it could take days, even weeks, for a person to die. Okay, it's not usually a quick death. All right, although Jesus does die rather quickly on the cross. So it was a shameful practice, a humiliating practice, and what we see in the Gospels is that you know there's in the Gospels there is a kind of the word I'm thinking of is confusion, but that's not the right word that I want to use. There's kind of the embarrassment. That's a better word. There's kind of an embarrassment about the crucifixion. They never describe it. None of the Gospels describes what happens to Jesus. Jesus is stripped and then he's just on the cross crucified. Okay, they crucify him. But there's no description of how it happened and blood spurting everywhere. I talked about that movie, The Passion of the Christ, in class and how I didn't like it because I thought it was just so overboard. I mean, beyond overboard on the whipping and the beating of Jesus that it was just, to me, it was just, it was like torture porn. It just wasn't, I didn't feed my faith at all. But if it fed your faith, God bless you. I hope you liked it, whatever. I did not. But anyways, the Gospels don't describe it. They're embarrassed by it. None of Jesus's apostles apparently is even at the crucifixion. They don't even go there to say goodbye to him. Only some women who followed him. Some women. And maybe his mother, but we're not sure even if his mother was there. John says Mary was there. And one of the apostles. Oh, no, not the one of the apostles. He says the beloved disciple, which I assume is. Forget what I said about the apostles. John in the gospel says Mary was there. But John is an artist, and John might have his own theological reasons for placing the mother of Christ at the cross. All we know is that nobody else, Mark's gospel doesn't know of it. And Matthew and Luke are copying Mark's gospel, but also there's a lot of material for their passion narratives that seem to be original to them, that things that aren't in Mark's gospel, and they don't mention it either. But then again, they could just be copying Mark in that case. But Mark doesn't know of it, and it's kind of odd that you'd mention all the names of other women, Mary Magdalene, Salome, I think a woman named Joanna is there. But Mary, the mother of Christ? You wouldn't mention her being at the cross? Okay, maybe not. Maybe it was just out of respect because it was such an awful scene. They didn't want to, include Mary, even though she was there. Possible. I don't know. Nevertheless, most of the apostles are not there. They had lost faith in Jesus with the crucifixion. It was a shameful, humiliating death. And so there were few of Jesus' followers at the cross, at his burial. No one was waiting at the tomb 3 days later for Jesus to walk out, like he supposedly said several times, "Hey, I'm going to be killed, but don't worry, I'll rise again." Well, if they really believed that, where were they? They weren't at the tomb. They're hiding. They don't want to get crucified either. They don't want, they're part of Jesus's revolutionary movement apparently. And Jesus was killed for treason. They don't want to be killed. So they hide. They run away and hide. So, that's what happens to their faith. Their faith in Jesus is actually shaken. Okay. I talked about, I'll talk quickly about this picture, the Alexamenos graffito. It dates to around 200 AD. I forget when it was found. I want to say it was found in the 1800s. I'm pretty sure it was found in the 1800s in Rome. In what apparently was a training school for slaves, people think. Nevertheless, archaeologists were digging around and they uncovered this graffito, which is a scratching on a wall or on something, like writing on a wall is called a graffito, picture on a wall. That is quite early, and it seems to be our earliest representation of the crucifixion of Jesus. And we talked about this in class, so I'm not going to go into real great detail with what we talked about. I'm just going to give you the bare bones, all right? Yeah, as with artwork is necessarily ambiguous. Okay, we talked about this before. We've talked about this before in the course, the difference between artwork and writing, all right? because we don't have any, with artwork, you usually don't have any words that can give you some sense of how to interpret. But we do here. We actually have a combination of artwork, but we also have words. The artwork shows a crucifixion. It shows a cross. It shows the cross beam, the pole in the ground, the cross beam. It even shows the footstool that they sometimes put on the cross for people to stand on. Now, that was not an act of mercy, my friends. The Romans were not being nice by giving you a footstool to stand on during the crucifixion. You might think, oh, well, that's nice. Now they have something to rest their feet on, so it makes it easier to push up and down. That's true. It does make it easier. It also makes your time on the cross last longer. So it was not an act of mercy. Anyways, so clearly there's a crucified being or thing here. It looks human, 2 arms, 2 legs, but the head is not human. The head looks like, someone in class said, a horse, a donkey maybe. Someone said a dog. I think Mr. O'Neill said a dog, which is possible. I mean, art is in the eye of the beholder, I think, a lot of it. I personally think it looks more like a horse-like, an equine-like animal, and not so much the head of a dog. But Mr. O'Neill is not the first person who suggested that, okay? I've read articles, or I've read information from some scholars, not a lot, but some who try to argue that this is actually, yes, this is a representation of an Egyptian god. The problem is that we don't have any stories of any gods from Egypt. And they do have animal heads. There are a lot of gods in Egypt that have animal heads, the heads of birds, the heads of dogs, etc. But not one of them has a story of a crucifixion. Not one of them has been nailed to a cross or hung from a cross. So when you're trying to think of, well, what person do we know of in history who's famous for having been crucified? Jesus kind of springs to mind, all right? And once we read the words that are etched into the wall here, I think it becomes clearer that we're probably referring to Jesus, because we have another figure here, which looks like a man or a person, 2 arms, 2 legs. He's dressed up. He looks like he's in the dress of a slave. How do you know that? I don't know, but that's what some scholars believe. It's a slave dress. And he's raising his arm in salutation. That was how you said hello. When you greeted someone, you put your arm out, your right arm out like that, and hail, ave, all right? Or salve. And it was a form of greeting. The Nazis did not invent the Nazi salute. It comes from Rome, the Romans, and for all I know, the Romans stole it from somebody else. But it's associated with ancient Rome, and it was the custom of how you greeted people. So this person standing on the right side of the cross, from the perspective of the picture, is lifting his arm in salutation or honor towards, apparently, the figure on the cross. And I say towards because this figure has his face and body apparently turned towards the figure on the cross, and the figure on the cross, the horse's head is looking down at that figure, okay? Now we come to the words, and it's in Greek, not in Latin, but Greek was the common language at the time. And here's where we get the name for this, the Alexamenos Graffito, because it says Alexamenos, and I wrote this on the board, so I'm not going to write it again, Alexamenos Sebete Theons. Alexamenos Sebete Theon, which roughly translated into English means Alexamenos worships his God. Alexamenos worships his God. So that kind of these words that we have now kind of interpret the art for us. Okay? It seems like this is an image of the crucifixion of Christ, of Jesus Christ, all right, who is being worshipped as God, but it's not by a Christian, because why would you substitute the head of Jesus with the head of an animal? So it's probably not a Christian who did this picture. It's probably someone who's making fun of Christianity. It's not Alexamenos worships God, yay! It's like Alexamenos worships God. Yeah, because you have to understand that the fact that the Christians worshipped a crucified God, a man that they said was God, who was crucified as a criminal by the Romans, sounded to the Romans like insanity. It sounded like the greatest stupidity. Okay, um, so it's completely would be completely plausible that a non-Christian would make fun of this fact. You know, here's your crucified God, Alexamenos. Go worship him. Which would, you know, the crucifixion was not something honorable, even amongst Christians, as I told you in class. Christians in the first few, 100 centuries usually avoided the cross. They used other symbols to depict Christ. Sometimes cross-like symbols, but they usually stayed away from actual representations of the crucified Jesus. It was still too shameful for a lot of people to look at, and it was also too funny to a lot of non-Christians, who would make fun of it. And so the Christians didn't want to open up their religion or their faith in Jesus, something so sacred to them, what happened to Jesus on the cross. They wouldn't want to open it up to derision. So they wouldn't, display it openly. Okay? Also, you had the belief that Jesus rose from the dead, so they didn't want to necessarily emphasize his death so much because he wasn't a dead man. He died. He was a dead man for a few days, but he rose bodily from the dead. So this is interesting. The Alexamenos Graffito is, as far as we know, our earliest depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, and it's not, ironically, apparently, most likely, by a Christian. It's most likely by a non-Christian, a pagan making fun of the crucifixion. Okay? Yeah. All right, let's move on from that. Crucifixion. But that's not where the story ends. If the story just ended there, then the life of Jesus would be a tragedy. Okay? Because for a lot of people, Jesus was a good, holy man. Okay? You're taught to believe that about him. Unless you're an Orthodox Jew, then you think that Jesus was a deceiver and he got what he deserved. He should have died. In the case of, say, more conservative Jews, like Orthodox Jews, Haredim, Hasidim, they'll tell you honestly that Jesus was a false Messiah and he deserved to be crucified for his blasphemies. If they were blasphemies. I mean, if Jesus was claiming to be God, then he certainly was not a good Jew from their perspective. All right, he was leading people away from the truth of Judaism, which is that there's only one God, and he's not a flesh and blood man. So, I mean, the story of Jesus is kind of a tragedy. Jesus, this this nice guy, this holy guy, this good man, who just apparently is in the wrong place at the wrong time, or his mission is misunderstood and he gets whacked, he gets nailed to a cross. Or you could take the other view of people who are just like, Jesus was a crazy man. He was delusional. He wasn't necessarily a good man. Maybe Jesus was delusional and he got himself killed. He went to Jerusalem. He stirred things up. Started proclaiming that he was some kind of king figure and he was going to bring about the end of the world, and the Romans got wind of this and they killed him. Or of an opponent of Jesus, like I mentioned, Orthodox Jews, Jesus was a bad man. He would, whether he's delusional or not, he was just a mixed up man who was lying to people, saying he was God, saying he was the Messiah, changing the law, breaking the law, not living as a good Jew, teaching others not to live as good Jews. And yeah, he got himself killed. And for some Jews, they would say good riddance to him then, because he was a deceiver. That's the story if Jesus had died on the cross and that was it. And if that's true, if there is no resurrection, which is the Christian belief, that Jesus was raised bodily, physically back to life by God. If that's not true, then Christianity is pointless. I might as well, as I told you in class, I might as well set up an altar and start burning incense and candles to the god death. Draw a picture of what I think death is and start worshiping death. because that's the truth then. Because if even a good, and I believe Jesus was a good man, if even a good man like Jesus can be swallowed up in death, no matter what the good he did, he can still get screwed and just end up as a bunch of bones in a tomb somewhere, or maybe not even in a tomb, just thrown in some open grave with other criminals. Then, and there was no resurrection, it's all just fairy tales. Then what's the point of anything? Worship death. I should just worship death. Burn incense to death. Offer my prayers to death, because clearly death is more powerful than God, especially if Jesus was claiming to have been God, or God couldn't have raised Jesus from the dead, because death always wins, even in the story of Jesus. Apparently, if there's no resurrection, death always wins. Christianity is the only religion where death does not win. Okay, it's every religion. Forget about Islam, because Islam comes later and is based off of Judaism and Christianity. But a lot of the pagan religions, even the gods get killed at the end of time in a famous battle. In Hinduism, one of the oldest religions on the planet, one of the oldest living pagan, or the oldest living pagan religion, even Brahma, even the gods die for a period of time. At the end, Brahma, the creator god, has about, I think, 4 trillion years that he exists. Yeah, is that an age of Brahma? Yeah, I think it's 4 trillion or maybe 3 trillion years. No, wait a second. Maybe it's 311 trillion years. So maybe I'm off by a few hundred trillion years. And then he dies, and the universe kind of goes into a stasis, and then everything comes back again. And the gods are regenerated by something. They just kind of pop back into existence out of this divine whatever. Okay, if you want to know about that, you can take World Religions with me whenever I'm teaching it. Teaching it next semester, by the way. Wink, wink. If you want to take it, be a lot of fun. But yeah, but in Christianity, no. God has power over death. Death does not have the last word. God confirms the claims of Jesus by raising him back to life from the dead. Okay, and this makes all the difference. The resurrection, resurgo, which in Latin means to raise up again, to lift up again, to stand, literally to stand up. You surge up, you stand up. Jesus stood up out of the grave. And the resurrection changes everything. And so when we're talking about encountering sacred writings, to encounter the Gospels, you actually kind of, in a way, have to read the Gospels from the end and read them then read to the beginning, okay? Because all the stories about Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the things that happened to Jesus, all of those are now impacted by the fact that Jesus rose bodily from the dead and started appearing to his followers. God glorified Jesus and confirmed that he was the Messiah of Israel and that he was indeed God's son. Okay? And this happens because people see him again. They don't have visions of him. They don't claim to have visions. Some people have visions of Jesus. But the original people are not claiming that, oh yeah, I had this experience, this feeling that like Jesus was just there and I felt like I saw him. And so, no, it was, I saw Jesus physically in front of me again. The crucified Jesus. He still had the wounds in his hands, the wound in his side. Okay, he was flesh and bone. He ate with me. He ate with us. There were other people there. And someone might say, well, maybe you misunderstood or whatever. You wanted Jesus to be alive again. You were in such grief, whatever. Sure, I would imagine the apostles and the early followers of Jesus were grieving. But grieving don't mean believing. Okay? Because just as you and I would be skeptical, I might grieve if my mother died and when she's going to die. I mean, she's an old woman, and I know she maybe has 20 years left, I hope. But she probably, in reality, has less. And when she dies, I'll grieve her. But if I open the door one day and there she is standing in front of me again, physically standing in front of me, touching me, saying, "Here, hold my hand," hugging me, kissing me again, after a while when she was stone cold dead, okay, my first response is not going to be like, "Oh yeah, just like I expected. I was grieving, I wanted my mom back." No, we're all skeptics at heart. We're all disbelievers. We don't trust our senses, actually. Okay? People think they trust their senses. They don't. Because you can easily make people disbelieve things that they've seen and make them think things haven't happened that happened to them. As you can also create memories for them and make them think that things did happen, or they kind of remember something happening that didn't really happen, or it didn't happen the way that they remember it. So all of the followers that Jesus appeared to after his death in the flesh, there was not one of them who was overjoyed by it. Their first response was complete skepticism and denial, because these things just don't happen. And it made no sense to them. And I went over this during class. You have to understand what the resurrection was about in that time of Christianity. And when you're reading, you can take this to you when you're reading the Gospels. This is part of your encounter with the story. Because we read the gospel now in the light of Christian faith. And even if you don't believe in the resurrection, you don't think those things just don't happen, Dr. Dunn. Okay, fine. But you kind of go with the story. All right, Christians want to believe, this happy Hollywood ending, Jesus comes back, yay, yay, yay. We get to have a sequel, but that's not what happened, Dr. Dunn. And the early followers didn't believe that either. They knew that. They knew that's not what happened. And they didn't necessarily believe that that's what happened. Okay? The belief in the rising from the dead was a rather late development in Jewish belief. It had only really kind of taken hold maybe a century or two before the time of Jesus. Okay? And there were a lot of Jews at the time of Jesus who still denied belief in it. They thought that once the body died, the life breath died with it. The life breath went away. The body and the soul, or the life, the breath of the body, were one and the same. So when one wasn't working, you didn't have one, you didn't have the other. The most that you could hope for in Jewish belief was going to a kind of, I mentioned this Sheol in class, which is a kind of underworld, an underground dwelling of darkness, and just, it's a dreary place, okay? You're disembodied I wonder if you are disembodied in Sheol, or do you take your body with you? I'd have to look that up. But anyways, you're somehow present in Sheol, but you're separated. God doesn't even hear the prayers of the people in Sheol. So God isn't even present in the underworld. And it's not like hell. You're not burning, but because all people go there, the good and the bad. So an especially righteous person, a good person, goes to Sheol, and an especially bad person goes to Sheol. They both go to the same place in ancient Jewish belief. And it's not a happy place. It's not a sad place either. It's not a place of suffering like hell. But it's not a happy place either. You're not in the presence of God. That was the best that the ancient Jews could come up with. And it took a while for it to develop into something better, where people suddenly realized, wait a second, God is a God of everything. He's a God of life. So why would he send a person who's good, who's righteous, who tries to do his will, who listens to God and follows God, who's a friend of God? Why would God send someone to, this is the reward? What's the point of a good life? On the other hand, what's the point of a bad life? Well, you'll get punished. God will reward you in kind. If you are an enemy of God, God will be like an enemy to you in the afterlife. You'll go to a place of pain and darkness and separation from God. But all of this, so this kind of idea of an afterlife, or, no one came back from the afterlife. No one came back from this afterlife. That was something that both Jews and non-Jews agreed on. Okay, Jews and Gentiles. No one, people went to the underworld when they died, but nobody came back from it. All right. For the pagans, like the Greeks and the Romans, they did believe in reincarnation. So if you did come back from the dead, you would come back in a completely new, fresh body. You'd be reborn as a baby and you'd youthful, okay? You wouldn't be reborn as you died like a decrepit old man. That would be a nightmare. If you came back in the same old, decrepit, corruptible body, no, you get a fresh new body and a new start on life when you're reincarnated for them. For Jews, there was no reincarnation. You just simply went to Sheol and that was it. But another idea started to develop in tandem with this, that yes, God rewarded those who had died and punished those, rewarded and punished those who had died. But there was another belief that developed, and this is more the resurrection, properly speaking, that developed late, was that at the end of time, God would reunite the life breath that we have, call it a soul, would unite the life breath with the physical body of human beings. Okay, he would in a way recreate, he would blow life back into, he would revivify our bodies, and all people would be raised from the dead, and there would be kind of a judgment, and the good would go to hell, and the bad, the good would go to hell, the good would go to heaven, and the bad would go to hell. All right. Yeah, but this again was a late development, and it happened at the end of the world, and it happened to everybody. So we have a couple of issues here with the resurrection of Jesus as it's told in the Gospels. First of all, it happens to Jesus. It doesn't happen to the whole world. All of the dead are not resurrected with Jesus. Okay? So that's puzzling, because if you were actually a Jew at the time of Jesus who did believe in the resurrection of the dead, this would make no sense to you that just Jesus would be raised. You'd be looking around like, where are the other people? Where's the end of the world? Because that's what you would have expected. It was the end of the world. Another issue was that, as I said, this belief in a resurrection of people physically coming back from the dead was a late development in Judaism. Some Jews believed in it. We know Jesus believed in it, but not all Jews believed in it. Okay, like the priests who in the temple were very conservative on certain religious issues, and apparently the resurrection was one of them. They recognized that the resurrection of the dead that a lot of Jews believed in was still a late belief and was not the traditional view that was espoused, that was taught about and written about in the sacred writings. And so they followed the Bible that they had, which didn't mention any resurrection of the dead. And so the group of priests, most of them apparently, who worked in the temple, did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. It was a late development. It was other Jews. So we don't even know that all the followers of Jesus even believed in the resurrection of the dead. If they knew what it was, this is our third point, because it was a late development, not everyone even knew what the resurrection was. They didn't have that, the concept had not percolated down and not filtered down into the Jewish mindset yet of what even a rising up of the fleshly body meant for them, because that wasn't really part of their worldview. And you can understand that given what I told you about their views of the afterlife and how they viewed the body and the soul, that they were one and the same, and if one died then the other was gone too. So sometimes in the Gospels, when Jesus talks about rising from the dead, he says, I'll be killed, but don't worry, I'll rise from the dead. The gospel writers admit, they're candid, that Jesus's apostles even did not know what Jesus meant by it, and they were afraid even to ask him. Okay? They were scared to go any further with this question because it was such a novelty, apparently. But they didn't understand. Once it happened to Jesus, they started to understand. So that's why, the authors write. They write the saying of Jesus, but it's now reinterpreted in the light of the resurrection. The author, the evangelist, writes down, but by the way, we didn't understand this saying of Jesus because we didn't know what a resurrection from the dead meant yet. But now we do. The resurrection changes everything, confirms Jesus as the Messiah and confirms him as the Son of God, even though he died on the cross. He died a shameful, horrific death. And if we don't, I can't say this enough, if we don't understand that essential fact, you will not understand Christianity, and really you won't understand how to read the Gospels. Because they're good news. They are the good news. And that's why the Gospel writers are called evangelists. Okay, we talked about Gospels before. So we know the word evangelion, which means good news in Greek. So they are called the good newsers. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and others. You didn't have to write a book to be an evangelist. You didn't have to write a book to be an evangelist. If you went out proclaiming the faith in the risen Christ, that Jesus is risen from the dead or had risen from the dead, you could also be called an evangelist. But the word evangelist is usually reserved for the four gospel writers. Okay, so they're called the evangelists because they're telling the good news. Not that Jesus died and is dead, but that Jesus is alive. He's the living one. And so in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 638, we have this statement. The resurrection of Jesus is the crowning truth of our faith in Christ. A faith believed and lived as the central truth by the first Christian community, handed on as fundamental by tradition, established by the documents of the New Testament, and preached as an essential part of the Paschal mystery along with the cross. Let's look at these words here. Crowning truth, the central truth, fundamental, established, essential. Okay? I'm going to change this because I want to emphasize those words. I want you to focus on them. Okay? Look, read, start to getting a feel. Don't just read, but a feel for what the author's trying to tell you. Okay? The resurrection, the rising of Jesus, okay, is the truth that each of the evangelists wants to pass on to you. Not historical details, although those are present in the Gospels. Okay? Not even the stories of Jesus so much, because there's a selectivity. The resurrection even kind of affects how each gospel writer views Jesus and the things that he wants to say about Jesus. And there's so much to say about Jesus, the evangelist can only select certain bits that he knows about Jesus. Okay? The Gospel of John is great for this because the Gospel of John is organized in such a way that you can kind of see it clearly. All right? That's been clearly organized according to different events from Jesus' ministry. All right? You can kind of see the same thing in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew clearly applies a structure to all the stories that he has about Jesus. And there might be many more. I mean, the Gospel of Mark is the first, and it's quite short. And if Jesus had, as we traditionally believe, a 3-year ministry, you might ask yourself, is that all Jesus had to say and do in 3 years? And a lot of times in Mark's gospel, it just tells us Jesus was preaching to the crowds, and Mark tells us nothing about what Jesus preaches. It's like, Mark, write it down. Tell us, you were a friend of the Apostle Peter. And didn't you ask Peter, like, okay, what did Jesus say on that occasion? Didn't you want to know? But Mark just writes in his gospel, and Jesus preached to all these crowds, and then he went to Capernaum, and everything. It's like, stop. What did Jesus say? But that's not the encounter Mark wants you to have with Jesus. He wants you to encounter Jesus, the crucified one, who is alive again, who is not in the tomb, dead. Okay, the last thing, skipping past that I mentioned, and I'll do this quickly because I know I've probably gone over time, I would imagine, but the last thing I wanted to go over was the year 70 AD, because as I told you, it was important for our dating of the Gospels, and it's another way we encounter the Gospels. It's an historical event that helps us to understand the Gospel writers. Let me put this on the floor here. And the way they're telling their stories. Because there was a war after about 30 years after Jesus died, or a little over 30 years, in 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans. And I forget why. I want to say it had something to do with taxation or something. But I forget exactly what happened that caused the revolt. It might have had something to do with the temple, too. They were going to put an idol in the temple, I think. Maybe that was it. There was Emperor Caligula, maybe, comes to mind, who's going to put an idol in the temple. Anyways, but the Jews rioted. There was an insurrection, a coup, and they actually defeated the Romans, the Roman armies that were there. I guess they were caught them off guard, caught them by surprise, and they pushed out the local Roman armies for a few years, actually. And there was a state of independence for a little while. So everything looked kind of rosy, like, hey, no, the Romans came back. And the Romans won this war in 73 AD, but in the year 70 AD, the Roman armies marched on Jerusalem and burned down the temple, the second temple. In 70 AD, they destroyed it. And you can see the remains and the ruins of that temple to this day in Jerusalem. Okay, you can see the walls of the temple and stuff like that. None of the structures is there because they burned those down. And since that time, Islam emerged in the 7th century AD, and they took over Jerusalem at some time and built a big mosque over where some of the structures of the temple were. So that's a big problem, at least for Jews, if they want to rebuild the temple. But in 70 AD, they burned down the temple, and you can see archaeological evidence for this, not just in Jerusalem with the destroyed temple, but here's an arch of Titus, who became emperor, but I think he was the general at the time. But anyways, which was constructed in Rome to celebrate the military victory over the Jews. And it shows here the people carrying out various instruments from the Jewish temple, like the candelabra, the candles that were kept before God in the temple, or were they kept outside? I mean, I think they might have been outside of the Holy of Holies, but then again, I think they were inside the Holy of Holies. I'll have to look. I'd have to look it up. Anyways, and here I think this seems to be Jewish slaves, Jews being taken as slaves. But anyways, so 70 AD. This is a major date for the Gospels because it helps us to date, no pun intended, each Gospel. All right, somewhat accurately, because Jesus himself made a prediction during his ministry that the temple would someday be no more, that it would be destroyed. And in typically Jewish fashion, he kind of overstates the case. I love you, Jesus, but and he says to his apostles, his disciples, "You see this temple? There will come a day when there will not be one stone left upon another stone that will not be thrown down." You know. So there won't be a stone upon a stone, and even those, if they are, they'll be thrown down as well, you know? Complete destruction, all right? And the apostles asked him, Jesus, when will this be? When this is going to happen? And Jesus enters into a long discourse, and it's called the Apocalypse of Mark. It's in the Gospel of Mark, one of the few times where we actually get a long-ish discourse by Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, where he goes over all the signs that will happen, before these things occur. And it's a mixed up discourse. I mean, some of the stuff seems to be end of the world type stuff. Some of it might be related to the prophecy, but nevertheless, the Christians remembered that Jesus prophesied the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Jesus believed it would eventually happen. But when in each gospel mentions it, each gospel mentions it in one way or another. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John mention Jesus mentioning something about destroying the temple being destroyed. Mark's gospel, and we know it was in 70 AD, Mark's gospel doesn't seem to have knowledge of it having happened yet. The prediction of Jesus is just there, okay, but there's no, it doesn't give a lot of detail or anything, okay, it's just kind of stated. And so a lot of scholars think that indicates that Mark's gospel was probably written before or sometime before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Hence, Mark's gospel is dated between 65 and 70 AD. Matthew and Mark, when they retell the prediction, when they copy the prediction in their gospels from Mark's gospel, especially Luke adds a number of details to his retelling of the prediction. And Matthew has some stuff as well, which seem to indicate to scholars that they know that it's happened. There seems to be an underlying an underlying knowledge in retelling Jesus' prediction that it's happened. And like each author, both Matthew and Luke, is kind of adding their little, I told you so, or rather, Jesus told you so. And whereas Mark isn't doing that in his gospel. So it indicates that Mark probably is before 70, Matthew and Luke post date 70, which is why Matthew and Luke are dated from what dates did I give you? 80 to 85? Or maybe in the 70s. I think I said 80 to 85 on the PowerPoint. I wish I could remember. Um, and John is seemingly much later. Okay, John, I don't think we know. We just assume that John was written later, after 70. But John also mentions the destruction of the temple. But I don't know if you can tell from the way he tells the story that came before the destruction of the temple or after, whatever. Anyways, so 70 AD is a paramount date in New Testament studies and for reading the Gospels, because even the way the Gospel story is told seems to have been told in light of that destruction of the temple, which is a great, think of tragedies. It was a great tragedy for the Jewish people. It is still a tragedy for the Jewish people, especially those who want to rebuild the temple. But even for Christians, it was a tragedy because, now we kind of look on it as, Christianity is so separate from Judaism that, and there's been so much animosity between Jews and Christians for so many centuries, especially from the Christian side, that we demonize the Jewish people, have demonized them, I think. It became hard for us to think that, if you were a Christian in the first century AD, around the time of 70, you wouldn't necessarily been cheering the destruction of the temple or not caring about it. Because as far as we know, the apostles and early Christians still went to the temple to pray, still participated in some way in its worship and its practices. They were, of course, yes, they were probably apparently meeting by themselves to celebrate the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. They had their own ceremonies that they kind of added that were totally Jesus focused. But it wasn't like, it was like all of a sudden, boo, Jews, They were all Jews, almost all of them. They were, as far as we know, they were all Jews. They didn't hate them. They weren't Jew haters, and they weren't self-hating Jews. God, they were happy Jews because the Messiah promised to Israel had finally come. And it was Jesus. So, it was a major date that for Christians. It was not the triumph of Christianity in any way, shape, or form. So that was the last thing I wanted to say, and that's the last thing on the PowerPoint. So I'm going to end here. I know I've spoken, I think, more than I should have, and I'm sorry for that. That's Dr. Dunn for you. But God bless you all, and I hope you do well on the exam. And if I don't have another chance, God bless you to say this. God bless you all in your life and whatever you're doing. If I never see you again, and if you never see me again, and I die, please pray for me that I will go to heaven, and I will pray to you when I'm there in purgatory and certainly in heaven. I will pray for you, my students, that God will bless you. Amen. All right, see you guys. Let's see if I can turn this off. There we go.